So a couple of announcements before we get going. The lovely people at Grome House have asked me to inform you of a couple of upcoming talks that they think will be of interest to Pictish Art Society members. On Thursday, the 20th of October at 7:30, Gilbert Marcus will be asking, can Iona shed light on Rose Marty? And on Thursday, the 10th of November at 7:30, artist Thomas Keyes will be examining folio 27 verso of the Book of Kells and looking at it in detail. So both sound very interesting talks. We will try and circulate the details to all members. We will try and get the information up on our website and Facebook site, but you could also just Google Grome House Museum and you'll get the information there. So without further ado, let's get started with the first talk of today. And it's a great one of the wonders of Zoom technology is that we have a long-standing Pictish Art Society member, Helen McKay, joining us and speaking to us from Australia. You've been a member for a long, long time, Helen, but I'm guessing with the advent of Zoom, you're certainly, I mean, your face has appeared at some of our autumn and spring lectures. So on a Friday evening, I don't know when that is for you time-wise in Western Australia, but I'm guessing it's not an overly convenient time.
No, it's the dead of the night.
Dead of the night. Well, there's commitment to the subject, so it's great to have you on.
Oh, thank you.
So Helen is, she's actually just recovering from a rather nasty accident, so she's going to play a pre-recorded version of her presentation, streaming it from Australia, so hopefully better sound quality than we had yesterday with Mark's gaming talk. But just, you know, bear with it, turn your volume up if it's sounding quiet, put the headphones on. And Helen's going to talk to us about the Pictish beast with some interesting ideas. So Helen, if you go ahead and share your screen and set your PowerPoint running, please.
Okay, thanks, John.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the Pictish symbol, generally called the Pictish beast. And strangely enough, this is a story all about goats, and about one particular little goat that became a beautiful white mare. So let's begin. Now, over the years, there have been many proposals about the meaning of the Pictish beast. It's a dolphin, it's a big whale, it's an elephant, it's a Capricorn. But my personal favourite has always been the water horse, the Kelpie, because with a prominent symbol like this, carved all across the land, it's reasonable to expect that we should find traces of it within folklore. But unfortunately, coming at the problem from this angle, we can't prove any of these suggestions. So what I'm going to do today is approach the problem from the point of view of looking at the aspects of the symbol to see what it can tell us. Now here I have a collage of various examples of a Pictish beast. And what's interesting is that although each of them are slightly different, they all seem to be drawn after a particular model. It's not a random idea that people are expressing. So let's turn first to counting. It turns out that the crescent of V-rod is the most frequent symbol at about 1 in 5. And the double disc and Z-Rod and the Pictish Beast come in roughly second, about 1 in 10. But what's really interesting is that when I divide it into class 1 and class 2 symbols, then they go from 9.6 to 19.2%. In fact, they're more than double in the class 2 period. And that's unusual. Most symbol frequencies stay roughly the same. Symbols come in to what I call faces. They either face to the left or to the right. And when I divide the numbers up into left and right facing symbols, something interesting comes up. In the class 1 situation, we only have 2 out of 29 examples of the Pictish Beast, which face to the left. But when we come to the class 2 symbols, we seem to have this whole new group of left-hand facing symbols. There's 15 of them suddenly. And this seems to be responsible for this sudden rise in the numbers in the class 2 stones. When I look at the iconography of class 2 stones, it turns out that for left-hand Pictish beasts, 9 of them also have left-hand horsemen on them, whereas for the right-facing Pictish beasts, only 2 have riders. Now, that's not a clear one-for-one association by any means, but it suggests that there is some sort of association going on here. Which brings us to the subject of horses. We can see from the iconography that the Picts hold the horse and riding in great esteem, and yet there really is no horse symbol when we really do expect a lot of horse symbols. There is only one instance where a horse on its own occurs, and that's on the Inverurie stone, but it's not accompanied in a pair, as if it's not really a symbol. And yet the Pictish beast does occur quite frequently, again suggesting that there is some sort of connection here to a horse. And yet if the Picts wanted to draw a horse, they're perfectly capable of drawing a horse. So it's going to be more complex than just a horse. So are there any other stones which give us a hint? And there is a pair of stones, the Nig symbol stone and the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, which actually seem to have a parallel iconography on them. In the area I've marked in red, you can see the Hercules killing the Nemean lion, which people have suggested is being reinterpreted as David. We have a rider in purple. We have in green, we have some sort of tree iconography. And in the yellow, we have the spearman with his hounds and a deer, which leaves us with the blue section, this light blue section. And I'll bring this down. On the Nig stone, we have some sort of bird, either an eagle or a raven, over the Pictish beast. On the sarcophagus, we have a winged griffin over a horse. So again, this is a very clear indication that the Pictish beast can, at least in some circumstances, be equated to a horse. So let's look at the clues so far. We know that the horse is a high status animal for the Picts, but there's no realistic horse symbol. And yet the Pictish beast is high frequency, as we'd expect for a horse symbol. We see that the left-hand riders often occur with left-hand Pictish beasts. And we have a Rosetta situation with the Nig and the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, where a horse and the Pictish beast seem to be equated. And as expected, we can find a prominent type of horse in folklore, the water horse or the kelpie. So let's keep going. The next thing I'm going to start looking at is the distribution of the symbols. And again, I've divided this into class 1 and class 2 because there is quite a distinct difference in the centuries. In the class 1 group, it's interesting that you can see certain concentrations of the symbol. The first is around the Spey and Rhynie. Secondly, there's another at Kintor Inverurie. And thirdly, there's quite a lot around the southern area of Angus and Gowrie and Fife. And you can see in the class 2 symbols that the distribution changes, but there's very much a concentration in that Angus and Gowrie region. So we're going to look at more closely the southern distributions of the symbols. And here again is the class 1 stones. Now these are all the class 1 stones, and the ones with the Pictish beast on them have the yellow center. And you can see that the distribution is quite tight. But the Pictish beast symbols are scattered broadly through that distribution. But before I go on, there's something interesting. This yellow part is where we have place names that denote the Caledonians, and it is outside the symbol region. And here we have the Maite, and again, no symbols in this region. So it begs the question of, who are these symbol carving people? What was their name? And I would suggest that this is the original Virturiones, but I seem to be a bit on my own in that respect. There seems to be a distinct break between the class 1 symbols and the class 2 symbols. And that break is probably the same one we see in archaeology between about 200 AD to the mid-400s AD. And now we see the stones very restricted. In fact, they're only really at 4 centres at Old Strathmartine, Meagle, Aberlin, and St. Vigins. But what's really interesting is that we see a concentration of Pictish beasts at Meagle and Strathmartine, and the double disc and Z rod seems to occur further over to the east in Angus. When we add all the other class 2 stones into this map, we find there is a continuation of the concentration of the Pictish beast symbols in blue dots in the area of Gowrie, and the double disc and Z rod, which are the mauve dots, in Angus. So it seems from the very start of C2 stones, there is some sort of district or territorial division basically going on between what is now Gowrie and Angus. But the question then is the Pictish beast somehow related to the name Gowrie? This is where it gets really quite difficult. This area is known as Magkurgan in early documents, but that name is last mentioned in an event around 600. Then we have this really black hole of textual references until we hear of Angus in 937 and then Gowrie in 1130. But we just don't know what these districts were called in these later Pictish years. And Nicholas Evans sums it up quite nicely when he says, "It is difficult to determine whether these territorial terms referred to originally Pictish units, which became better attested in later sources, or whether they replaced Kirken. So we don't really know whether this territorial division seen with the symbols does equate to Gowrie at this early stage. But I have found two references which suggest it may be quite an old name. The first is from the Book of Taliesin, and it says, ravens shall wander in Pridden, that's in Pictland, in Aidan, Edinburgh, in Gaffran, Gowrie, and in the quarter of Brecon. And the second is quite confusing. There's an early Dalriatan king called Jochid Bud, and his descendants are said to be the men of Fife. But in this genealogy track, his descendants are called the Gabroni, which seems to equate the Gabroni to the men of Fife. And there is, as we'll see, reason to think that in the very early stages, the district of Gowrie did encompass some of the areas of Fife, but it's not clear. So all I can do at this point is just continue and investigate this name Gowrie and see where it takes us. But in the meantime, there has been another suggestion that Gowrie is named for an early Dalriatan king called Gabran MacDomangart. That isn't acceptable, but I'll deal with that as we go. Let's look now at this word Gabor, which is at the base of the name Gowrie. Dill gives us 4 meanings. First, it's a white mare. Second, it's a goat. Thirdly, it can be a modifier, meaning bright and white. And fourthly, we are told it is the name of the sun. From a modern perspective, it's really difficult to imagine how one word could encompass all 3 meanings. But one thing I'm pretty sure of, the Celts really did know the difference between a horse and a goat. The problem is that in mythology, in art, in stories, the Celts don't do goats. They really don't like goats. Goats are almost non-existent in Celtic art, right from the Iron Age onwards. They're non-existent in stories, pretty much. There's one story from an old lady in the middle of Ireland who said that the Cailleach tends to her goats on the high mountains, which is a nice environmental picture. And other times we're told that the Cailleach does herd her wild animals on the high mountains, but they're usually referred to as the deer. So it's very, very rare for goats to ever even be mentioned by Celts. There is another instance in the Welsh story where Lugh, they're trying to kill Lugh, and he has to stand with one foot on what is translated as a goat. But when you go to the actual text, he actually uses the word Gabor, meaning it could be a white mare or a goat. Now, this becomes really obvious when we look at neighbouring cultures. Let's go to Norse and Germanic to begin with. Here's Thor, the Norse god of thunder, and he has 2 goats who drive his chariot. And these 2 goats are interesting because they can be also killed and eaten in the night, and they'll come alive in the morning. So they're the source of never-ending food. And if you think of that theme in Celtic lore, you have the Dagda with his pigs who he puts in the cauldron and feeds his warriors, and they come alive again in the morning. So we have this same theme, but it's in an entirely different mythical space. Another goat in the north sits right on the top of the world. She's the goat that sits at the top of Valhalla. And rather than provide milk, she provides never-ending mead for all the warriors in Valhalla. And again, if we think of Celtic lore, we have that same theme of the never-ending mead. But this time it's Gobnu the smith who provides that never-ending mead. So it's the same theme, but a totally different mythical space. In Greco-Roman culture, we have a prominent god, Mercury, whose animals are the goat and the chicken. And so goats feature quite prominently in religious festivals and rituals. If we go across to Babylon, here's an Assyrian guardian spirit holding a little goat, which is really cute. There's lots and lots of goats in Babylonian art, for example. So no matter where you go in the world, you find goats. It's just the Celts who don't do goats. Here is an example of the utter disdain and contempt that the Celts hold the goat in. It's a story about Sweeney, who's a king in Ireland, and he comes up against a saint, and this saint curses him, and Sweeney goes mad, and he spends most of his life naked, flying through the trees. But at one stage late in the tale, Sweeney regains his sanity, and he decides to go home. But the saint hears that he's coming home, and he prays to God, God, don't let him come home. And so God sends the Bocchini, the goat heads, to drive Sweeney into insanity again. So I'll read it to you. Great in sooth was the terror, the crying and wailing, the screaming and crying aloud, the din and the tumult of the heads after him, as they were clutching and eagerly pursuing him. Such were the force and swiftness of that pursuit that the heads leaped on his calves, his hoofs, his thighs, his shoulders, and the nape of his neck, so that the impact of head against head and the clashing of all against the sides of trees and the heads of rocks against the surface and the earth seemed to him like the rush of a wild torrent from the breast of a high mountain. Nor did they cease until he escaped from them into the filmy clouds of the sky. Poor Sweeney. Let's now turn to names that are based on this word Gabor, because there's quite a few of them. Firstly, we have Gabron, which is the name of the king of Dalriata. But we also find this name several times in Ireland, and it also occurs in the Welsh Triads, although there it may be a mistake for Aidan McGabron. But one thing we can be sure of at this point is that no Celtic king worth their salt would ever have a name meaning little goat, but a name that's based on the white mare of sovereignty is a perfectly good name, an appropriate name for a king. And when we go down to the continent, there are many Gaulish names of various forms, all based on this word Gabor. So it's a very common base to personal names. We also have group names with the Gabor base. So we have the Gabrantovici, which was a British group located near Whitby. We have, of course, the Kennel Nabron, the group from Dalriata. And we have Gaborkind, which is an Irish war group. But when we come to place names, there are many of them, and they're all over the Celtic lands. We find them in Gaul, in southern Britain, in Dalriata and Pictland in northern Britain, and we find them, of course, in Ireland. So this is really interesting because now we have something really good to sink our teeth into, because the way place names work tell us a lot about the way they are formed. So let's jump across first to the Mull of Kintyre, which I've outlined in purple. Now, in Pictish days, we know this as the home territory of the Kennel Nabron, which are a group of Dalriata, and they're thought to have descended from Gabron MacDomingat around the 500s. But what we find is that Ptolemy tells us that this same area was once inhabited by a group of people called the Pictish. And he tells us this in 150 AD, possibly working from texts which are maybe a couple of centuries old at that point. And of course, Epidii has the root epos, which is another horse word, and it's also the root of Epona, the horse goddess. And then over the years, we have many place names and personal names in this area using epos or ek or gabor, right down to today, when it's still the home of the clan McKay, which translates as son of the horse lord. So this is amazing. What we have here is probably over 2,000 years of history where the Mull of Kintyre continues to name people and places for the horse. But if we go down a little bit further to the Mull of Galloway, it too turns out to be covered in Gabor place names. And this is actually a picture of what a Gabor is, or at least one thing that the Gabor is. At the Mull of Galloway, there are 9 different tides, and at various points, they all rush together and they cause utter chaos, and it's a very dangerous situation. And this brings us back to the idea of water horses. The water horse, for many years, for 20 years, I went around saying, oh, I think the water horse is perhaps like something like the spirit of the river. But that turns out not to be true. It's actually the force behind the water. So it's more like how we would use horsepower rather than horse. So the seahorses can manifest themselves as the tides in the sea. They manifest as mountain cascades and waterfalls and the flow of rivers, particularly at dangerous fords. Next, we'll go across to Ireland. And the first one we'll look at is the Royal Crannog of Lagore, which is Loch da Gabor. This is the biggest crannog in Ireland. It was the seat of kings, and it's not far from Tara. But the Dinshanicus tell us a nice story about the naming of this loch. Eged Kinmark, which translates as horseman, horsehead, king of Munster, sent 2 white mares to Ina Egnic, king of Tara, as tribute, and they were drowned in the lake when a stallion chased them, whence Loch Gabor, Lake of the Steeds. And here we start to see a theme of the 2 Gabor, but we also have associations here of kingship, of horses, and of water. This is Immenmarka, or Ardmarka, if you like. This is the famous early seat of the Ulster kings, and we have a story here of the horse goddess, Marka. She's a divine person who marries an earthly man, and that man goes to a festival held by the Ulster king, where he skites that Marka can run faster than the king's horses. So the king demands that she race his horses, even though she's in the pangs of labour, which she does, and she defeats the horses and then puts a curse on the Ulster men. But when we look at the language being used, the horses, the king's horses that she's racing, are the Dá Gabor. Down in Kilkenny in Ireland, there is a district called Gowran, which was the seat of the kings of Ossory. It has a river, Gowran, running through it, but it's most famous in the Dinshenikas for the pass of Gabron. Now, the relevance of this to our district Gowrie in Pickland is that we can see that there's no need to go looking for somebody to have named the district after, because all these places are seats of kingship and they're named for the Gabor herself. This is the Hill of Tara, the seat of the High Kings of Ireland. So how does Gabor fit here? Well, to the east, there are two wells at the top of Tara, and there used to be two beautiful waterfalls that came off those wells, and they joined together at the base of Tara to form a river, Gabor or Gowra. And that river then flows to the north and then across to the west along the northern base of the Hill of Tara. This valley that the river Gowra runs through is the famous valley that the Irish government put a freeway through, despite being told that it would be really full of archaeology, and of course it was. In fact, they found one of the biggest henges ever right near the river at the base of Tara. And this valley is also famous for a very famous story about the Gowra, the Battle of the Gabor. And this is the battle where Finn McCool and his men decide they've had enough of their King Connor and they're going to fight him. And in that battle, most of the Fianna die. And so there's licks and stones and cairns all along that river valley that have the names of various Fianna on them. But here again, what we're seeing is the seat of sovereignty, the Gabor, and water. Let's now come back to Britain. And this is a place called Ardgefren. It was the seat of early British kings in what was later to become Northumbria. And it's usually translated as the height of the goats. But I'm hoping that by now you might be thinking, maybe not. Maybe the name translates as the height of the white mare of sovereignty. Ardgefren is quite like Tara. It's a high standout hill. And when you climb to the top, it's like the whole world is spread out at your feet. Now, the Anglo-Saxon kings did hold this site for a short time before they moved out to Bamborough on the coast. And there is an Anglo-Saxon grave here with a goat in it. But we know that to this very day, the word Gabor still holds both meanings of the white mare and the goat. So it's not really surprising that the Anglo-Saxons, who are really very much into goats as the creatures of Thor and Valhalla, that the Anglo-Saxons would perhaps prefer the goat meaning. Then let's come back to East Lothian law. Now this is a drawing of what they think East Lothian law looks like. Massive, again, another one of these standout hills that you see the world from. And what's really interesting is we don't know what it was called. And for many years, I've pestered place name specialists. What do you think this place was called in Pictish times? And finally, one of them said to me, I think it's something to do with the Gabor because it's in the parish of Kilgore. And that really makes sense. And what we have, remember the two cascades coming off the hill of Tara? Well, here we have two cascades coming off East Lomond Law. One of them goes down to the little parish church now of Kilgore, and the other comes down to a place called Westfield, and I've outlined these both in red, where the Pictish stones were found. And both of them have these beautiful cascades coming off the mountain. It's a classical Gabor situation. So again, it's not just Gowrie. The Gabor just continues all over the Celtic lands to be both the white mare of sovereignty and the cascade and the power of water. So what else can we think of that the symbols might be showing us? Now, there's one last thing to say. We know that the symbols come in basically two types. There's the geometrical ones, and then we have the beautiful real animals, the boars, the bulls, the wolves, etc. But we only have two mythical beast symbols. So the question is, how did they fit into the scenario? One of the mythical beasts is what's called the S-beast, and it has the same shape as the constellation Scorpio. And although I don't have time to go into it now, it's reasonably easy to identify as Draco and as the red-jawed Onku. So it's reasonable to assume that if one symbol can be located to a constellation, then perhaps the other one should be too. And so we come to Capricorn as the most likely candidate constellation. And here I've taken the stars of Capricorn and I've put the Pictish beast symbol over those stars. And as you can see, it's quite a good fit. Now that doesn't prove it's Capricorn. It proves that it can be Capricorn. Now Capricorn is really, really interesting. I've looked for the name in Irish. They only use the Latin Capricornus. But in Welsh, bingo, we have the Welsh using the term Gabor for Capricorn. And that is a very cool moment. But the importance of this is that it is the constellation of the winter solstice from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And so it becomes perhaps the most important constellation of all. And something else happens later in the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, and that's that the horse arrives and becomes a high status animal. And my feeling is that what has happened is that because the Celts have a structured oral philosophy, they don't have room to expand it to include a horse. So what they've done is that they've placed the horse over the goat, and in doing so, they've basically displaced the goat out of mythology. The great thing about being able to connect the Gabor to Capricorn is that it gives us a date. And so we now land in a very nice place that is very well documented. First of all, Epona has a feast day, which the Romans tell us is on December 18, which is actually the first day of Capricorn. But to this day, we have traditions all over the place of the Christmas horses. We have the Marilou, the Loravon, the hobby horse, and so on. But the fascinating thing is that when we go over into the North Germanic regions, we have the same tradition, but here they're still using goats. So we have the Yule goat, and even in England we have the old tap, and in Wales we also have the grey goat. But when I look for a name that is very ancient and very widespread all over Europe, there is one candidate that stands out, and that is the puka. Now you can see this has buck, which is a goat at its root, but when you see the puka in mythology, it's acting as a water horse. Do we have any other clues that this has happened? Well, here's the Tor's pony cap. We have a cap for a horse with goat horns, and it's dated to around 200 BC. And here is the Uffington white horse, a beautiful white mare on a hill, hey, with a beautiful fort beside it. And it's been dated somewhere around the Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. So the timeline is looking good for this changeover from the goat to the horse. In summary, let's look at the ideas we've come up with for the Pictish feast. The first is that she is the Gabor, the white mare of kingship. Next, she is also the water horse, the Kelpie, the Ekishka, whose power drives the rivers and the cascades and the tides of the sea. And the Gabor replaces the goat of the constellation of Capricorn in the Celtic West. And this is tied to the critical period of the midwinter solstice. And of course, the Gabor also goes by many other names, such as Epona, probably Rhiannon and Marka, the Laura Vaughan, but the most widespread name is the puka. Finally, we might come back to the symbol stones themselves and ask, where might we now expect to find the Pictish Gabor symbol? And we do find it at royal sites at Rhynie, Ardley, Chapel of Garriock, Dunsinane, Dundee, Kintore. We also find it at river crossings, especially where there is a dangerous ford. So Loch of Fleet, Glenfernus, Inveravon, Meagle. And we also find it at sea crossings, the Broch of Bursay, St. Meadows, Scooney. And of course, we have a number in the region of Gary itself. But we might also suspect and keep our eye out in case there are midwinter solstice alignments present. And at the end, near the end of the C2 stones, stones tend to become personal memorials. And so any stone here with a Pictish feast, we might think of as a memorial for a king. So that's the story so far. That's the story of the little goat who became the beautiful white mare of kingship.
Thank you very much, Helen. That came across loud and clear, streaming all the way from Western Australia. We should have got you to broadcast Mark's presentation yesterday, I think, loud and clear. So thank you very much. You stopped sharing the screen. So you're hopefully up for doing some Q&A. Once people, please put your questions into the chat box and I will relay them to Helen. I was quite taken with the horseman horsehead name. It just the kind of name that translates is it horseman horsehead?
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me on the Boaty McBoatface that the public came up with for the underwater exploration submersible, the name that was popular but never used.
It certainly sounds like it. Yeah.
Okay, Lorna Carter is saying, how would you explain that the Gadlig, G-A-D-H-L-I-G, word for goat is gobar, but the word for the horse is each.
Okay, so for goat, there are a number of goat words in the language. There's bak and pok and cadla, as well as gabor. And the same is for the horse. There are loads of horse ones that for all different sorts of horses and their functions and all that sort of thing. It's only the gabor that is both. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Lorna, let me know if you're happy with that. No, she says no.
Oh, okay.
Could you clarify any more, or? Helen, can you clarify that question any more? No,
no, I don't think so. I don't know what to say any more than that.
Right. Oh well. Okay. Just waiting to see if any more questions come up here. It's an interesting theory. I certainly had a colleague back in the Royal Commission who was convinced that the Pictish beast was a goat, but stylized with its horns and its head down charging, which I was never quite convinced of, just simply because their depictions of real animals were, for the most part, very unambiguous and really quite clear, and they didn't seem to be going through a process of stylizing naturalistic animals into anything developed beyond that. So I was never particularly swayed by that idea.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. Barbara Thompson says that she has a copy of the Mabinogion and recognises the excerpt. So there you go.
Yeah, that's
Very
right.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. There's, as I said, there's almost no mentions of goats at all in the Celtic stories at all. But with Lugh, he has to be killed with all these different sorts of impossible situations, like not inside or outside. So he has to stand on a threshold, and not day and night. So he has to be at dawn. And so what he's told to stand on is a bak gabor, which means it's a male, female goat or horse. Right. So it's an impossible situation. So it's very interesting. It's a wonderful story. Yeah.
John and Helen, sorry, a question just came directly to me. Is it all right if I read it?
Yes, please go for it.
That's okay. So Graham, he's lamenting that he cannot engage properly because his computer doesn't have a microphone or a camera. But he says, I am holding up a large placard headed "The Mysterious Pictish Beast Identified?" which was displayed at the Age of Migrating Ideas conference in the National Museum of Scotland in 1991, augmented by a video of the living animal. My solution was a botto. Ever heard of it? I hope I've said that right, Graham.
How do you spell it?
I have here B-O-T-O. I don't know if that might be a typo.
It's not a wind-up, is it? Perchance.
I don't know.
No, sorry. I don't know what a botto is either.
No, right.
Well, if he writes back to me, I'll clarify.
We'll all have to go and Google that one. Okay. Is this from Graham Cruikshank?
No. Yes, it is.
Yes. Right, okay, right. Because I know in the past, Graham has put forward the idea that it's a freshwater dolphin as found in the South America and in the Far East rivers of Vietnam and China and the likes.
Yes, well, even the Romans knew that dolphins didn't have legs, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And this is where I started off this talk. You know, people come up with all sorts of ideas, but until you can follow that through and actually find something to support that idea, you can, it just remains as an idea. You can't really, you know, chase it down any further.
Yeah.
So that's what I've tried to do by using the features that the symbol is displaying and the place names to actually draw a picture behind what it is. So
okay, just to say that Joe Clements has posted a web link for Wikipedia for the bottle, so we can all go look at that during the break. Thank you,
It is
Joe.
a dolphin. It's a type of dolphin.
Oh, right, it is.
Right.
It's Graham and his freshwater dolphin again. Yeah, okay. Sorry, Graham, I'm not buying it. Okay, thank you very much, Helen, for a fascinating talk, and well done doing it in your current state of health. We wish you a full and speedy recovery.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your perseverance, and great to speak to you all the way there in Western Australia. Thank you so much. And we will move on now, and I will